The man who said it wasn't cruel. That was the thing nobody understood later, when the story circulated through rehearsal rooms and green rooms and late-night conversations between musicians who had been there. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was simply stating, with the calm authority of someone who had spent 30 years inside the machinery of the music industry, what he believed to be true. His name was Dennis Holt. He was 51 years old in the autumn of 1993, a veteran session musician and occasional producer who had played on records that sold millions of copies, records that people still hummed in supermarkets without knowing who had made them. He had a way of sitting in a room that made the room feel smaller, not because he was imposing in any physical sense. He was slight, quiet-voiced, the kind of man who ordered the same thing at every restaurant, but because he carried with him the particular confidence of someone who had outlasted trends, who had watched movements rise and collapse, who had survived by understanding the difference between what was real and what was temporary. He had been invited to the session by a mutual acquaintance. That detail mattered. He hadn't sought it out. He was doing someone a favor by showing up at all. The studio was in Seattle, a converted warehouse space on the east side, the kind of place where the heating system made its own rhythmic noise, and the carpet on the walls had started to peel at the corners. It was a Tuesday. The light that came through the single high window was gray and indifferent. Kurt Cobain was sitting in the corner of the live room when Dennis arrived. Dennis noticed him immediately, though he said nothing about it later. Or rather, he said he noticed a person in the corner, someone young, someone folded into the space between an amplifier and the wall in a way that suggested he either hadn't found a better place to sit or had chosen that particular corner deliberately. He was wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades. His hair fell across his face. He was holding a guitar, a battered Maserite, sunburst finish mostly worn to bare wood. But he wasn't playing it. He was just holding it. The engineer, a man named Travis, who spoke in single syllables and communicated primarily through the orientation of his shoulders, introduced them briefly. Dennis shook hands with several people. He didn't remember shaking hands with the young man in the corner. He might have. He couldn't be certain. What Dennis did remember, with the photographic specificity that the mind reserves for moments it doesn't yet know are significant, was the way the young man was holding the guitar. It was wrong. Not wrong in the way that beginners are wrong. Not the familiar wrongness of someone who hasn't yet learned where the thumb is supposed to go. This was a different kind of wrong. The guitar sat across his lap at an angle that Dennis had never seen before, tilted slightly forward, the neck angled in a direction that the biomechanics of the instrument seemed to argue against. The young man's left hand was wrapped around the neck in a way that looked more like gripping than fretting. His right hand rested near the strings with a looseness that suggested either profound relaxation or profound indifference. Dennis watched this for a moment. Then he said what he believed. "You're holding it wrong." The young man looked up. Dennis continued, not unkindly, because he genuinely believed he was being helpful. He had seen this before. Young players who had taught themselves, who had developed habits in isolation, who had never had someone sit across from them and show them the correct way. It wasn't their fault. It was simply what happened when talent outpaced instruction. The angle you're carrying the neck at, you're working against yourself. The thumb should be behind, not over. If you play like that for another 10 years, you're going to have problems. The young man said nothing. He looked at Dennis for a moment with eyes that were very blue and very calm. The eyes of someone who had heard many things said with great authority and had learned to let them pass through him like weather. Then he looked back down at the guitar. Dennis turned to speak with the engineer about the session. He had made his observation. He had done what an experienced musician did when he saw someone developing bad habits. He moved on. What happened next was quiet. That was the word Travis would use, years later, in the only interview he ever gave about that afternoon. Quiet. Not in the sense of silent. The heating system was still running. There were people moving in and out of the control room. Someone was eating something that crinkled. Quiet in the sense that what Kurt Cobain did next seemed to happen in a different register than the rest of the room. It didn't announce itself. He started to play. Not loudly. He wasn't plugged into an amplifier. The sound that came out of the Maserite was acoustic, thin, the natural resonance of a hollow body without amplification. It was the kind of sound that shouldn't have carried across a busy room. It did anyway. Dennis heard it before he understood he was hearing it. He was mid-sentence when something shifted in his attention. Not a dramatic shift, not a jolt, but the quiet reorientation of a compass needle finding north. He stopped speaking. He turned. The young man in the cardigan was still sitting in the corner in exactly the same position, holding the guitar in exactly the wrong way, and playing something that Dennis could not immediately name or categorize. It wasn't a song he recognized. It might have been something the young man was making up as he sat there, or it might have been something he had carried around for years, waiting for a corner to sit in. There was no way to tell from the outside. What Dennis could tell, within the first few seconds, was that the playing was unlike anything he had heard in 30 years of professional musicianship. Not because it was fast, it wasn't particularly fast. Not because it was technically complex in the ways that technical complexity usually announced itself. The cascading scales, the deliberate showmanship of someone who wanted you to understand what they were doing. There was none of that. There was instead something that Dennis would spend several years trying to describe and never quite manage, something that had to do with the relationship between what the notes were and what they meant, between the physical act of playing and the emotional content that the playing carried. The guitar, held wrong, was speaking. Travis had stopped adjusting the board. The other musicians in the room had gone quiet without deciding to go quiet. It was the kind of silence that assembles itself without instruction. Kurt Cobain played for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he stopped. He looked at the guitar. He turned it slightly in his lap. He looked up and his eyes moved briefly around the room, not performing a survey, not checking to see how the room had received what he'd done. And then he looked back down. Dennis Holt stood very still. He said nothing. Not because he couldn't speak, but because the things he might have said had rearranged themselves into something he didn't have language for yet. He had been about to say something before the playing started. He could not now remember what it was. The engineer Travis broke the silence by adjusting something on the board that didn't need adjusting. Someone near the control room door cleared their throat. The heating system continued its rhythm. The session resumed. Dennis drove home in the rain that evening, taking the long route without meaning to. He thought about technique. He had been thinking about technique for 30 years. It was the infrastructure of everything he had built, the framework inside which his career existed. Technique was what separated the professionals from the people who played in corners. Technique was the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had come before, translated into instruction, passed forward. Technique was the correct angle of the neck, the proper position of the thumb, the biomechanically efficient approach to the instrument. He had told the young man he was holding it wrong. He turned this over in the rain. The young man had been holding it wrong. That was still true. The angle was still anatomically suboptimal. The thumb position was still technically incorrect. None of what Dennis had said that afternoon was factually wrong. And yet, he thought about what the guitar had sounded like. He thought about the silence that had assembled itself without instruction. He thought about 30 years of sessions in studios and records that sold millions of copies, and the particular feeling, the feeling he had not felt in a very long time, of hearing something that made him forget he was listening. He didn't know who the young man was. He hadn't asked. In the way of busy professional people who move through rooms full of strangers, he had noted and assessed and moved on. And the name, if it had been offered, hadn't stayed with him. He found out 3 weeks later. The record came out in September. By November, it was everywhere, in a way that records almost never were anymore, in a way that cut across the demographics and the formats and the careful segmentation of the marketplace. It was on the radio while Dennis was driving. It was coming out of a television in a hotel room. It was being discussed in a way that music was rarely discussed by people who didn't usually discuss music. Dennis listened to the record alone in his studio. He recognized the voice before he recognized anything else. The quality of it, the specific relationship between the sound and the meaning, was something he had encountered once before, in a different form, in a corner of a room in Seattle on a Tuesday afternoon in the rain. He sat for a while after the record finished. Then he found Travis's number and called him. "The kid from the session," Dennis said, The one in the corner with the Maserati. Yeah, Travis said. That was him. Yeah. Dennis was quiet for a moment. I told him he was holding the guitar wrong. Travis said nothing. I told him if he kept playing like that, he was going to have problems. I remember, Travis said. Dennis looked at the wall of his studio. 20 years of photographs, framed records, the documentation of a career built on technique and professionalism, and the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had come before. He is holding it wrong, Dennis said finally. The thumb position is still incorrect. Sure, Travis said, and he's the best I've ever heard. Dennis Holt gave one interview in 2002 for a small music magazine that no longer exists. He was asked about his career, about the sessions he remembered, about the moments that had stayed with him. Toward the end of the conversation, without being asked directly, he mentioned an afternoon in Seattle in 1993. I told him he was doing it wrong, Dennis said. I meant to be helpful. I had 30 years of knowing how things were supposed to be done, and I used all 30 of them to tell a 26-year-old kid in a cardigan that his technique was incorrect. He paused. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He just played. The interviewer asked what the playing had been like. Dennis thought about this for a long moment. It was like hearing someone speak in a language you didn't know you already understood, he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The guitar had said everything. It had said it from the wrong angle, with the thumb in the wrong position, held by someone who had never been taught the correct way and had therefore found his own. That was the thing about the wrong way to hold a guitar. Sometimes it was the only way to sound like that. Sometimes the wrong position was the one that lets you reach the note that technique couldn't find. Dennis knew this now. He had known it since November 1993, since the afternoon he sat alone in his studio and listened to a record and recognized something he had been in the same room with and failed to understand. He understood it now. He kept the understanding quiet. It seemed to belong to the same register as the playing, the register that didn't announce itself, that assembled its own silence, that moved through the room without asking permission. The wrong way, the only way, his.